Good morning. It's Wednesday, February 26th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 509 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. A quick note of thanks to the folks who sought me out at the annual APAC event here in Washington. A special shout out to Paul from San Diego. I truly enjoyed meeting you, and I'm sorry I couldn't join you for cigars last night. And to the other Morning Brief watchers I met over the last couple of days, thank you for the feedback. It's great to know that you enjoy the program. More importantly, thank you for allowing us into your lives for 20 minutes or so every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The funeral for Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir Bibas took place earlier today in Israel. The mother and her two young sons were taken by Hamas and then brutally murdered, only to have their dead bodies returned some 500 days later in the ongoing hostage diplomacy deal that is providing some Israelis a sense of relief while others grow more furious by the day. It doesn't help matters when Hamas fires rockets toward Israel out of Gaza, as was just reported an hour or two ago. I certainly can't speak for all Israelis, but I do know that this is a pivotal moment as Israelis debate the trajectory of this war. More on that trajectory in just a few minutes. Our guest today is Ted Deutch, a former U.S. representative from Florida's 22nd Congressional District, who currently serves as the CEO of the American Jewish Committee. Ted's organization keeps close tabs on the state of anti-Semitism in the United States. In fact, AJC has a new report out called State of Anti-Semitism. The report underscores how the world's oldest hatred has skyrocketed in America since the October 7th massacre. So stay tuned for that conversation in just a few short minutes. All right, let me say this up front. I am not a soccer fan, never got into the sport, but you know that extra time the players get at the end of regulation? That's what's happening right now in the Middle East. The end of phase one of the hostage deal is about to conclude. Neither Israel nor Hamas want to go to phase two. Israel doesn't want to end the war because it wants to destroy Hamas. For its part, Hamas simply refuses to cede defeat. For now, the two sides have found a way to keep the hostage for prisoner swap going. But it's the runoff at the end of the game. Time is winding down. If we are indeed heading back to war, a few things are likely to happen. For one, the Houthis in Yemen will start firing their ballistic missiles again. And when that happens, the Trump administration will have its first brush with the Yemeni terror group since returning to office. I don't envy the Houthis for that. But the Houthis don't act alone. It's the Iranian regime that provides them with the missiles, the targets, and the intelligence to terrorize the region. So here's the question. Will the Trump administration respond? And if it does, will the Houthis pay a price? Will Tehran also be held to account? I certainly don't want to see more bloodshed. The region has seen enough. But unless someone figures out a way to further extend this overtime, it appears the endgame will soon arrive. Now for your headlines. Headline one, the Trump administration escalated its maximum pressure campaign on Iran with a new round of sanctions. The administration slapped sanctions on over 30 targets. All of them are involved in one way or another with the sale and transport of Iranian oil. It was quite the list. Think oil brokers in the United Arab Emirates, tank operators in India and China, and the head of Iran's national Iranian oil company. The U.S. Treasury said that the sanctioned vessels were responsible for shipping tens of millions of barrels of crude oil worth hundreds of millions of dollars that went right into the coffers of the regime. Iran seemed unfazed in the wake of these designations. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi in Tehran. Iran and Russia have been working together to flout Western sanctions. At a joint press conference, Araghchi said Tehran won't discuss the nuclear file with the United States under the pressure of sanctions. So long as maximum pressure continues, Tehran isn't coming to the negotiating table. Okay, oh well. Headline two, things are getting hairy between Syria's new leadership and the Israeli government. On Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered remarks at a military graduation in which he said that Israel will not tolerate the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or affiliated forces in southern Syria along Israel's border. Israel's policy is that South Syria must be demilitarized. You'll recall that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, led the rebel offensive that ousted Bashar al-Assad from Syria in early December. HTS is an al-Qaeda affiliate group, and its leaders are now fully control the population centers in Syria. After Assad's ouster, Israeli troops moved into the buffer zone in South Syria. Yesterday, Syria's Islamist rulers condemned Israel's foray into Syrian territory and called on IDF troops to withdraw. Then last night, just as I was sitting down for dinner, I saw the news from Israel. The IDF struck several targets in and around Damascus. I guess that was Israel's response. And headline 3, speaking of Syria, an Israeli journalist uncovered troves of classified intelligence from the fallen Assad regime at Iran's embassy in Damascus. Israel's Channel 12 aired footage on Monday. Inside the embassy was a hidden door, and behind that door was a large server farm and piles of secret documents. The Israeli journalist said that the Iranians shredded a lot of documents, but plenty were left untouched. This room was an Iranian nerve center. The journalist described it as a power hub from which Tehran managed Hezbollah. The documents inside included lists of Hezbollah contacts and other information that I am fairly certain the Revolutionary Guards wanted to keep secret, certainly out of the hands of the IDF. I have a feeling that the IDF has a new set of targets to strike right now. So if you're a member of Hezbollah or the IRGC in Syria that had contact with the Iranian embassy there, I suggest you find a way to get off the grid, or to borrow from the Godfather. You might end up sleeping with the fishes. And now it's time for that interview with Ted Deutch of the American Jewish Committee. I often worked with him when he was a member of Congress back then. I called him Mr. Congressman. Right now, I think I'm allowed to just call him Ted. And I'm pleased to have a discussion with him on the impact of the war in the Middle East on the U.S. Jewish community, which we'll have right now. Welcome to the program, Ted Deutch.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
All right. Well, let's start with something I've been wanting to ask you ever since you left Congress. Do you miss it? I mean, what do you miss the most, if you miss anything? I mean, it's a very different atmosphere from when you were in Congress, is it not?
It is a different atmosphere, and the level of partisanship is higher than I think I've ever seen. But there are some things I miss. But the good news is, John, in my current role at AJC, I continue to engage with my former colleagues, with members of the Senate. I'm talking to you today from the Senate dining room before a number of meetings here, all giving me the chance to focus on the things I'm most passionate about, which is a thriving Jewish community around the world and a state of Israel that is safe, secure, and welcomed by countries all around the world. Yesterday, I attended the first meeting of the bipartisan anti-Semitism task force in the House, something that I helped launch with the support of AJC when I was a member of Congress. So there are great opportunities still to engage here and to work, most importantly, in a bipartisan way on issues that absolutely need to remain bipartisan. And the kinds of things that we work on are a great example of how to bring Republicans and Democrats together.
Well, that bipartisanship, I think, was one of your signatures back in the day. So really happy to see you continuing in that vein. I want to talk to you about AJC's mission for a minute. I've heard people say that AJC is sort of like the State Department for the Jewish people, diplomatic initiatives worldwide on behalf of the Jews. Is that a fair way of describing it, or is it bigger, wider, or more narrow than that?
Sure. Look, we're AJC is a global Jewish advocacy organization, and that means that in all of our offices and postings, 25 in the U.S., 15 more around the world, we spend our time working with leaders who can actually move the needle to make Israel safer and more secure, to welcome Israel, to normalize Israel's place in the world. And we work with Jewish communities in over 50 countries around the world to ensure that they're safe and thriving. And we do this by taking advantage of the relationships that we've built over decades. AJC is over 100 years old. I've been here now for 2.5 years and have brought my own relationships that we've leveraged to further cement our place as a global advocacy organization. When we travel around the world, whether it's at the Munich Security Conference or in Tokyo or Paris or any of the other places in Buenos Aires, places that we've been even lately, we have the opportunity to meet with senior officials, prime ministers, foreign ministers, defense ministers, because they understand the importance of the relationships that we have in the US. They know that when we're talking to them, their message will come back to the US, and they know that when it comes to standing up for the Jewish community in their countries and for their relationship with Israel, it's in their best interest as well to strengthen those ties so that their community is viewed more favorably here and around the world.
I'd like to see your passport. Let's talk about this new report of yours, State
Sure.
of Anti-Semitism. What are the main findings of this report?
Well, our State of Anti-Semitism in America report shows every year the impact that anti-Semitism has on the community. And this year, look, we've known what we feel, which is since October 7th, there's people have been uncomfortable. We've seen these rallies. We know that anti-Semitism is on the rise. What our report shows, what it offers, is the data confirming how bad it is. For the first time since we've been doing this report, 56% of American Jews say they've changed their behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism. That is, John, they've changed their decision making on where to go, what to wear, what to say because of their fear of anti-Semitism. And 77% of Jews in America feel less secure than they did a year before. And the most of all of the data points that we've seen, 13% of American Jews said they've considered leaving the United States due to anti-Semitism since October 7th. More than 1 in 10. That tells us that this is a challenge that not just the Jewish community, but the broader community needs to treat seriously because it affects not just the Jews, it affects our society as a whole.
That's a big number. I mean, that's funny. I was talking to folks, some folks yesterday. They were talking about citizenship by investment, that Jews are actually taking out second passports, going to places like Antigua and getting a home there and making sure that they have a place to go if they need to flee. That is something that's new to me.
Yeah, and the conversations that we've had with people who are going back and investigating whether there are programs that might allow them to get citizenship in Poland or in Lithuania, just so they have it, which is a jarring thing to think about given the history of our community. But this is why we do our work all around the world, because when anti-Semitism is present in a society, it goes beyond the Jews. It suggests that there's a deeper challenge, that the polarization has grown, that the extremism has grown, that we have to combat that together.
Yeah, what it is a sign of societal rot, in my opinion. History has shown that over time. You're watching the unraveling of politics and culture in given societies. This has been, I think, a trend in Jewish history. But the idea, by the way, of fleeing to Poland to escape anti-Semitism, that's a jarring thing to hear in and of itself. But here's my big question for you, Ed. How is it that anti-Semitism skyrockets right after the worst slaughter of Jews in the world since the Holocaust? I mean, the hate begins one day after the 10/7 pogrom, days before Israel even responds to this war. You'd think that there would be more sympathy. So what's going on here?
Right. Well, it's a really important question. And as you point out, the anti-Semitism started immediately after, not just before Israel sent any soldiers in to defend the people of Israel, but even as there were still terrorists on the ground in Israel, you saw protests of people who were marching in the streets for one purpose, which was to support that pogrom, to support the calls for death and destruction of Jews in the state of Israel. This is a really important point to make. Anti-Semitism we know this, but in the broader community, we keep stressing anti-Semitism didn't start on October 7th. In fact, the conversation that had taken place for a year beforehand, since Kanye went on his anti-Semitic tirade online, and we saw the banners across highways in Los Angeles, and we saw leaflets distributed in Jewish neighborhoods around America. That was a reminder that anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred, and that throughout history, whenever a scapegoat was needed, whenever there was a problem that someone wanted to point to, it's been the Jewish community that the finger was pointed toward. And so much of this, it's not new, and so much of it was latent. And in the case of what we've seen since October 7th, I would just add, if we look at campus, which is a great example, the anti-Israel forces on campus have been actively working for decades. And our community, I'm sorry to say, would often swoop in when there was a BDS vote, but then when things calmed down, we left. And what we've realized is we need to be in this battle on campuses all the time against these anti-Israel forces, because if we're not offering another approach, if we're not sharing facts, if we're not standing proudly for Israel, then what happens is they have the territory to go pollute people's minds with misinformation and dangerous efforts to try to target Israel and the Jewish community.
All right, I want to unpack that just a little bit more.
Sure.
I mean, I'd like to learn a little bit more about the anti-Semitism on campus and among younger people in general. This is not the ingrained hatred that you might expect to find among older Americans who may remember a time when anti-Semitism was maybe more normalized in the United States, right? There was a time where, you sort of had, I don't know, maybe it was more acceptable, maybe when I was younger, when you were younger. How did this particular strain of anti-Semitism, how did we find this, I guess, planted in fertile soil? It's growing right now, and there's no precedent for these kids. They don't have a basis for this. So how is it that they're taught this and that they're parroting it?
No, it's interesting. I spent yesterday morning with our Leaders for Tomorrow program here in Washington. We had about 250 kids from around the country come in to come up to Capitol Hill and advocate for the Jewish community and for Israel. And this is the conversation we had with them. For a lot of young people, they've not been challenged before. The situation for the community has really been so great, even as we've seen anti-Semitism on the far right, on the far left, the Christian nationalism, the rise of Islamic radicalism. Even as that's happened, by and large, they've been able to live their lives. And suddenly, October 7th happened, and the people that their fellow students that they thought that they were friendly with, the people that they stood next to and advocated for every other issue that their friends cared about, the moment came when they needed that support, and none of them were there, because what they came to understand is, over years there was this effort to go out and recruit people to take a virulently anti-Israel approach. And then October 7th happened, and it became clear that this debate about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is no longer a debate. We saw it, they felt it, young people felt it. Over 40% of young Jews, 18 to 29, have been targeted over the past year. 35% of college kids said they've experienced it on campus. And the place that's had the greatest impact on young people is online, where more than 80% of young people have experienced anti-Semitism online. And we're not competing, John, you and I, and people who have been doing this for a long time. We're not competing with other people who are trying to explain facts. We're competing with short TikTok videos and outrageous Instagram posts. And so the community is fortunately pivoting. We were behind. What October 7th told us is that the community really needs to rally both on campus, online. There needs to be more happening in Washington, in Congress. The Senate just announced they're going to have some hearings on anti-Semitism, which we're thrilled about. There has to be a whole of society approach. Otherwise, young people in particular are only going to continue to hear one dangerous viewpoint. And that's the moment we're in, and we're not going to let that happen.
Got a lot of work in front of us. Last question before I let you go. Sure. Tell us a little bit about AJC's Center for a New Middle East. That caught my eye.
Thanks. Sure. The Center for New Middle East built upon AJC's work all around the world advocating for Israel. We've been going to the Gulf for decades, back to the early 90s, long before the Abraham Accords, trying to establish relationships, because we've always seen the future of Israel really across the region and normalizing Israel's place in the region. So we were very supportive of the Abraham Accords, and almost immediately thereafter, opened the Jewish community's first full-time office in an Arab country, in our office in Abu Dhabi, AJC Abu Dhabi. we've continued to do regular trips to meet with leadership across the region. Our Center for New Middle East is now focused in a very important way on opportunities to change the narrative and to change Israel's place in the region, focused on diplomacy, on business, and on civil society. In business, we can do more programs like we've already done across the United States, bringing together Israelis and Bahrainis and Emiratis and others to help capitalize on the opportunities business provides. In diplomacy, we've been doing work at the highest levels, as I mentioned before, with all of the ministries across the region. And in civil society, our Track 2 work, bringing together young leaders from across the region and diplomats from across the region, has really helped solidify the place that we think the role that we can play in moving toward greater integration, normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi. If that happens, the potential for normalizing relations between Israel and more countries, many more countries across the Arab world, across the Muslim world. We have to think about, we've got to think about what the world is going to look like for Israel and the region, not just for the day after in Gaza, but for the decade after in the Middle East. That's what the Center for New Middle East is doing. We're very proud of it. Last night, we had a great event with Steve Witkoff, who laid out the president's and his vision of where this is going, very much in line with what we're trying to accomplish. And we look forward to being a partner with the administration and members of Congress and anyone who shares this positive view of what the future for Israel and the Middle East can be.
Well, you can count FDD among those that will work with you in this regard. Thank you, Ted Deutch, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Always good to talk to that guy. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague, Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery, has an article in the New York Post discussing the Trump administration's plan to reallocate up to $50 billion of the Pentagon's budget to strengthen U.S. defense capabilities. Mark emphasizes that cutting unnecessary government programs isn't enough. To achieve peace through strength, the U.S. must also eliminate outdated weapons programs that no longer meet America's defense needs. Yesterday, FDD CEO Mark Dubowitz moderated an event at FDD HQ with Yair Lapid, Israel's opposition leader and former acting prime minister / foreign minister. He presented his proposal for a day after plan for Gaza. Lapid actually suggested that the Egyptians take over Gaza for several years. Cairo responded not well to that. The response was immediate and negative. And I'm a little relieved about that, to be honest, because these are the people that allowed the tunnels and the smuggling across the Philadelphia corridor for months, if not years. If you haven't seen the discussion, you can watch it on our website, fdd.org/events. Finally, be sure to check out the 10 things to know about Turkey's intervention and influence in Syria. That's also on FDD's website. This was assembled by our Crackerjack comms team and our resident Turkey expert, Sinan Jidi. Spoiler alert, Syria's new regime is neither moderate nor tolerant, pragmatic, not either. And neither is its terrorist-supporting patron. And yes, I'm talking here about the government of Turkey. That's a wrap, folks. If you're craving more, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or check out our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please do make that tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another amazing episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest will be Adam Tarsi, the head of international cooperation at the Department of Defense's Irregular Warfare Technical Support Directorate, one of the most important offices in the Pentagon that you've never heard of before. My talented colleague, Brad Bowman, will be the one asking questions. I'll be hosting. So tune in for that. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.